There is a particular hour in the last years of the 19th century when a great city stops speaking and begins instead to listen to itself. It is somewhere after 2 in the morning. The theaters have emptied, the horse cars have thinned, the saloons have put up their shutters, and the streets that run down toward the East River have surrendered to a silence that is not quite silence. Because beneath the pavement of one narrow street, in cellars that never cool, the presses have begun. They start slowly, the way an animal starts, with a shudder that travels up through the flagstones and into the souls of anyone still standing on them. Then they find their rhythm. The buildings above them shake very slightly, in a way the tenants stop noticing after the first week. Ink is laid on paper at a speed no human hand could match, and the paper is folded and cut and stacked and thrown still warm into the arms of boys who have not slept and will not sleep. And by the time the sun comes up over Brooklyn, 1,000,000 copies of the world's opinion of itself are moving through the streets in bundles tied with twine. The street is called Park Row. For a period of roughly 20 years, it was the most concentrated engine of persuasion on the surface of the earth, and every building on it belonged to a man who believed with genuine sincerity that he was telling the truth. Two of those men are the subject of this account. One of them arrived in the country at 17, penniless, half-blind, speaking almost no English, and became within 20 years the most feared publisher in America. His name was Joseph Pulitzer. The other was born into more money than the first man would ever personally possess, went to Harvard, was expelled from it, and then spent his life trying to take from the first man the only thing that first man had ever earned for himself. His name was William Randolph Hearst. What passed between them is usually filed under a single phrase, and the phrase is yellow journalism, and the phrase is not adequate. What passed between them was a 20-year war over the attention of ordinary people, a war fought with cartoonists and comic strips, and stolen editors, and headlines set in type large enough to be read across a crowded ferry, and fought, in the end, over a real island where real men died. It changed what a newspaper was. It changed what a reader expected. It arguably changed the borders of an empire. And it ruined, in different ways and by different routes, both of the men who waged it. Subscribe for more documentaries on the great dynasties of old money. New episodes every week. Neither of them, at the beginning, would have recognized himself in what he became. That is usually how these things go. A man sets out to build something honest and discovers, some years in, that the machine he has built has an appetite of its own, and that the appetite must be fed daily, and that the only thing it reliably eats is other people's lives. The older man was born in a small town in the south of the Kingdom of Hungary, in a house that no longer stands, in a year when the empire above it was 3 months away from revolution. Most sources give the 10th of April, 1847. A number of others give the 18th. If any of you have access to documents that settle the question, leave a comment below. His father, Philip, was a grain merchant, prosperous enough by the standards of that district to move his family to Pest and to keep private tutors for the children. The boy learned German, he learned French. He grew unusually tall and unusually thin, and from very early on, he could not see well. There were several children. 2 of them lived past childhood, Joseph and his younger brother Albert, who will matter later in this story in a way that no one at the time could have predicted. Then the father died and the business failed, and the household that had been comfortable was suddenly not. What the boy wanted was to be a soldier. It is one of the small ironies of his life that the man who would spend 40 years attacking generals and presidents began by trying, repeatedly, to enlist. The Austrian army examined him and refused him. Weak chest, weak eyes. The French refused him. The British refused him. He was, by every professional assessment available to him at the age of 17, physically unsuited to any work involving exertion or distance vision. In Hamburg, he found a recruiter of a different kind. The American Civil War was consuming men faster than the northern states could produce them, and agents had been sent to Europe with bounties in their pockets to make up the difference. Passage was paid. The boy crossed the Atlantic in 1864 and served the last months of the war in a cavalry regiment raised in New York. in which most of the orders were given in German, which was fortunate because he still had almost no English at all. He was discharged in the summer of 1865 into a country full of discharged soldiers and empty of work. He drifted west. He arrived in St. Louis with nothing, and what happened there over the following decade is the part of his life that he himself would return to again and again in the years when he could no longer read. He worked as a mule tender. He worked on a riverboat. He waited tables in a restaurant where, according to a story he told against himself for the rest of his life, he was dismissed for spilling a dish over a customer. He slept where he could, and in the evenings he went to the mercantile library, which admitted anyone, and he read and taught himself law and taught himself English out of newspapers, and played chess badly enough that a man watching a game one night thought it worth striking up a conversation with him. The man was an editor of the Westlich Post, the German-language daily of St. Louis. In 1868, at 21, the former mule tender became a reporter. What his colleagues noticed first was the working. He was at the courthouse when no one else was at the courthouse. He was at the county offices before the clerks. He asked questions with a foreign accent in an entirely un-American directness, and he wrote them up at a speed that suggested he had somewhere else to be. Within 3 years, he owned a share of the paper. Within a few more, he had sold that share at a profit that would have kept a careful man comfortable for life. He was not a careful man. In 1878, at an auction of a bankrupt property in St. Louis, he bought a failing evening sheet called the Dispatch for a sum that would not have furnished a decent parlor. Within days, he had merged it with a rival, the Post, and the paper that resulted, the Post-Dispatch, became the first working model of everything he would later do on a larger stage. The model was simple and, at the time, close to unprecedented. A newspaper was to be cheap enough for a laborer to buy every day. It was to be written in sentences a tired man could follow. It was to entertain him. Crime, sport, oddities, the private disasters of the rich. And while it entertained him, it was to tell him, relentlessly and by name, which of the men who governed his city were stealing from him. Tax dodgers were printed as lists. Gambling houses were printed with addresses. The paper made enemies at a rate that alarmed its own staff. In that same year, he married. Kate Davis was from Washington, from a family with a Confederate cousin of some celebrity and no money to speak of. And she was, by universal agreement, one of the more beautiful women in the room at any gathering she entered. She was also, it should be said, marrying a man she did not entirely know. He had not thought to mention before the wedding that his father had been Jewish, and the discovery, arriving afterwards, shook her badly. They would have 7 children. 5 would live to be adults. By the early 1880s, the Post-Dispatch was returning profits that made its owner a rich man in a city that was not the center of anything. He was 35 years old. His eyes were already failing, and he had begun to think about New York. The newspaper he bought there in the spring of 1883 was called The World, and it was dying. It had been founded before the Civil War, had passed through several owners and several convictions, and by the time it came onto the market, it was losing money steadily every year and had a circulation that would have embarrassed a provincial weekly. It was owned at that point by the financier Jay Gould, who had no particular use for it and was glad to be rid of it. The Hungarian bought it on borrowed terms and set about doing to New York what he had done to St. Louis, at 10 times the scale. The transformation took less than a year. He cut the price. He widened the columns and then narrowed them again. He put illustrations on the front page at a time when respectable papers regarded pictures as an insult to the reader's intelligence. He printed headlines that stacked down the column like a staircase, each line more alarming than the last, so that a man could take in the whole of a story's temperature before he had paid his penny. He hired reporters who would go anywhere and pay for nothing and come back with a name. And he understood, before almost anyone else in the country, that the population of New York had changed underneath the men who owned its newspapers. Hundreds of thousands of people had arrived from Europe within living memory. They worked 12 hours. They read imperfect English. They had no interest whatsoever in the opinions of the merchant class of Lower Broadway, and every interest in the world in a paper that treated their landlords, their employers, and their aldermen as legitimate subjects of investigation. He gave them that paper, and they bought it in numbers that frightened his competitors. Within a year, the world was profitable. Within 4, it was the largest selling newspaper in the United States. And in the middle of that ascent came the episode that fixed its character permanently in the public mind, and which is still, more than a century later, the thing most Americans know about him without knowing his name. France had made the United States a gift. The gift was a colossal figure of a woman holding a torch, and it had been paid for by ordinary French people. And it arrived in the harbor of New York in pieces, in crates, with nowhere to stand. The pedestal was America's responsibility. America had not paid for it. The committee had run dry. The legislature had declined. The millionaires of the city had looked at the subscription list and found other engagements. And there was serious talk of Boston or Philadelphia taking the statue instead. In March of 1885, the World opened its front page and asked its readers for the money. It was not a polite appeal. The editorial pointed out, in language that made several people on Fifth Avenue extremely uncomfortable, that the statue had been paid for by French workmen and shopkeepers and girls in shops, and that it was not a gift from the rich of one country to the rich of another. The paper promised that every single person who sent anything at all would have their name printed. Not the large donors, everyone. The money came in coins. It came from school children in Iowa, from a kindergarten class that sent $1.35, from clerks and washerwomen and street sweepers, most of them giving less than $1 apiece. By the 11th of August, the fund had passed $100,000, contributed by something in the region of 120,000 people, and the pedestal was built, and the woman with the torch stood on it, and the world's circulation rose by 50,000 in the process, which its owner did not consider a coincidence and never pretended to. That is the shape of the man. It is genuinely difficult to say where the conviction ended and the promotion began. And the honest answer is probably that in his mind, they had never been separate things. He believed a newspaper existed to fight on behalf of people who could not fight for themselves. He also believed that fighting on their behalf sold newspapers. He saw no contradiction. For most of his life, there was none. 2 years later, he hired a young woman from Pittsburgh who had arrived in New York with no money and a stubbornness that outran her prospects. She wanted work. He and his editors gave her an assignment designed, in all likelihood, to make her go away, to get herself admitted under a false name and a feigned condition to the asylum for women on Blackwell's Island, and to find out what happened to the women inside it. She did it. She stayed 10 days. What she brought out, the cold, the food, the beatings, the perfectly sane immigrant women who had been committed because no one on the ward spoke their language, ran in the world in the autumn of 1887 under the name Nellie Bly, and produced a grand jury investigation and a substantial increase in the city's asylum budget. 2 years later, the same paper sent her around the world with a single bag, in a race against a fictional Englishman, and printed her progress daily for 72 days. And the country followed it the way it would later follow a war. By the end of that decade, the world was selling in numbers no American paper had ever reached, and its owner built it a headquarters to match. A domed tower on Park Row, gilded at the top, the tallest building in New York City when it opened. From the editorial floor near the summit, a man could look down on the spire of Trinity Church and on the offices of every rival he had ever humiliated. He could look down on them, at least for a little while. The eyesight that had kept him out of 3 European armies had been deteriorating steadily since his 20s. Toward the end of the 1880s, it collapsed. A retina detached. The other eye followed the first into fog and then into darkness, and by the age of about 40, he could no longer read a page of the newspaper he had built. Something else happened at the same time, and it was in its way more cruel. Whether it was consequence or coincidence, or the two things feeding one another, his hearing became not weaker, but unbearably acute. Ordinary sound arrived as assault. A door closing was a catastrophe. A soup spoon set down too firmly on a plate could end a meal. It was said that the striking of a match near him could send him into a state of suffering that took hours to subside. In 1890, at 43, he walked out of the newsroom of the World and never worked in it again. He did not, however, let go. That is the thing about him that his editors found hardest to forgive. For the next 21 years, he ran the most powerful newspaper in America by dictation, from a distance through a staff of secretaries whose principal qualifications were a pleasant reading voice, an excellent memory, and the ability to tolerate him. Instructions went out in a private code in which every editor, every politician, and every rival publisher had his own invented name. Reports came back and were read aloud. He would listen to a leading article being read twice and then dictate the version he wanted, sentence by sentence, from a chair with his eyes shut. He built rooms to be quiet in. At Bar Harbor, on the coast of Maine, he bought a rambling shingled house called Chatwold and added to it a granite tower with walls thick enough to defeat the Atlantic wind, double windows, a chimney designed so the draft could not moan. The secretaries called it the Tower of Silence. In New York, on East 73rd Street, Stanford White built him a Venetian palace with a soundproofed sleeping chamber devised in consultation with an acoustics expert from Harvard. And even that was not enough. And the architect eventually accused him, in exasperation, of being impossible to satisfy on purpose. And at last, because no house on land could ever be quiet enough, he had a yacht built, a great steam vessel, more than 250 feet of her, in which every bulkhead and every door and every porthole was engineered against noise, crewed by dozens of men and staffed by a dozen more whose whole employment was to read to a blind man, play music for him, and keep him talking. He was one of the richest publishers in the world. He owned the most read newspaper in America, and he spent the second half of his life traveling the oceans inside a padded box, listening to other people describe a country he could no longer see. It was during those years, while he floated somewhere off the coast of Europe with a secretary reading to him, that a young man in California decided to take everything he had. He had been born in San Francisco on the 29th of April, 1863, the only child of a marriage that was, by any measure, unusual. His father, George Hearst, had come out of a small farm in Missouri with almost nothing and an instinct for rock. He could look at a hillside and tell you what was under it, and over the course of 2 decades in the West, he was proved right often enough to become one of the wealthiest men in California. The great silver deposits of Nevada, the copper of Montana, and above all, a mine in the Black Hills of Dakota called the Homestake, which he developed in the late 1870s, and which went on producing gold for more than a century afterward. He was coarse, generous, semi-literate, and by the end of his life, a United States Senator, which he found agreeable. His mother, Phoebe Apperson, had been a school teacher in Missouri and was more than 20 years her husband's junior. She was small, exacting, and formidably cultivated, and she spent her life applying that cultivation to 2 projects: the museums, schools, and universities of California, and her son. The 2 projects were not equally successful. At 10, she took him to Europe for the first time, and it is worth pausing on that journey because everything he did afterwards was in some sense an attempt to repeat it. A small boy walked through castles. He walked through cathedrals and palaces and the treasure rooms of dead kings, with a mother who explained everything and denied him nothing, and he acquired somewhere on that trip a conviction that would organize the rest of his life, that objects of great beauty exist in the world, and that a sufficiently determined man may simply own them. He was sent east to school. He went up to Harvard, where he was business manager of the Lampoon and a member of several clubs and a genuinely popular figure, and where he distinguished himself academically not at all. He was suspended and then expelled for a series of pranks that the university found less amusing than he did. Among them, the delivery to certain professors of chamber pots with their own portraits printed inside the bowls. And here the story turns because of what he did next. He did not go home. He went to New York and he took a job, briefly, quietly, as an unpaid apprentice and then a junior reporter, on the staff of the New York World. He was in Joseph Pulitzer's building. He was watching Joseph Pulitzer's machine at the exact moment of its greatest ascent. The Statue of Liberty Fund, the Crusades, the stacked headlines, the illustrations, the price. He was 22 years old, and he was taking notes. And everything he learned in those months, he would later use against the man who had taught it to him. His father, meanwhile, had acquired a newspaper without wanting one. The San Francisco Examiner had come to George Hearst in 1880 as settlement of a gambling debt, and it was useful to him chiefly as a platform when he ran for office. It lost money placidly year after year. The son wrote to his father asking for it. The letter survives, and it is the letter of a young man who has spent a season inside the most successful newspaper in America and has understood precisely what he was looking at. He promised to raise the circulation by 10,000 within a year. He said the paper would have to be alarmingly enterprising and startlingly original. In March of 1887, at 23, William Randolph Hearst became proprietor of the San Francisco Examiner. What he did with it was the world transplanted and paid for out of a mining fortune. He replaced the presses with the best available anywhere. He raised the salaries of reporters to figures that emptied the newsrooms of his competitors. He printed the paper's new motto across the masthead, without embarrassment, monarch of the dailies. He hired a bitter, brilliant satirist named Ambrose Bierce to write a column and let him say almost anything he liked in it. He printed Mark Twain. Later, he would print Jack London. He also did something that ought to have warned everybody about him. The Examiner began investigating corruption in the water companies, the street railways, the mining interests of California, including on several occasions, concerns in which his own family held a stake. He was entirely sincere about this and entirely willing to use it. And again, as with the older man in New York, it is not clear that he ever experienced the two things as separate. Within 3 years, the Examiner was in profit. Its circulation had gone from a few thousand to more than 50,000. He had at 26 done in San Francisco something like what Pulitzer had done in St. Louis at 30. But San Francisco was not the point. It had never been the point. He had understood from the first month that a chain of newspapers across the country was impossible without the one city where the national conversation actually happened. And that meant New York. And New York meant the man in the tower with the gilded dome. His father died in February of 1891. The mining fortune, millions of dollars of it, went not to the son but to the widow, which tells you something about George Hearst's assessment of his own child. It was Phoebe who now held the money, and it was Phoebe who, in 1894, sold a substantial holding to give her son what he asked for. What he asked for was a failing New York morning paper called the Journal. There is an irony here so precise that a novelist would be advised to leave it out. The New York Morning Journal had been founded in 1882 by a publisher who understood cheap papers because he had grown up in the same house as the man who perfected them. His name was Albert Pulitzer. He was Joseph's younger brother, the only other child of that Hungarian household to reach adulthood, and the relationship between the two brothers had long since curdled into something cold and permanent. Albert had sold the paper on. It had passed through other hands and declined, and in the autumn of 1895 it was bought for something between $150,000 and $180,000, depending on which account you credit, by a 32-year-old Californian who intended to use it as a weapon against the man whose surname was on the deed of its founding. He moved into offices on Park Row, a short walk from the Golden Dome, and then he did the thing that no one had expected, because no one had previously had the money to do it. He cut the price of the Journal to a penny, undercutting the World, which cost $2. Then he went shopping. The most valuable property in New York journalism at that moment was not a building or a press. It was the Sunday edition of the World, and specifically the men who made it. The Sunday paper was a comparatively recent invention, and it had turned out to be a monster. On a Sunday, a working family had time. They read it through breakfast and into the afternoon, and a Sunday edition could carry 40 pages of crime, of science reported with cheerful inaccuracy, of women's fashion, of prize fighting, of the private lives of duchesses, and, most importantly, as it would turn out, of color comics. The man who had built that edition was Murrell Goddard. He was young, he was thoroughly amoral about subject matter, and he had an instinct for the exact story that a reader would describe to a neighbor the following morning. Under him, the Sunday World had become the most profitable single object in American publishing. According to the account that has come down to us, the Californian invited Goddard to a suite in a hotel and offered him a salary that made refusal absurd. Goddard, who was not a fool, pointed out the obvious risk. that what worked on the Sunday World might be the paper and not the man, and that if it was the paper, he would be worthless within a month. The reply was to hire the whole department. Every editor, every writer, every artist of the Sunday World crossed the street. It was not a poaching, it was an amputation. The older man, informed of it at a distance, responded in the only way available to him. He offered more money, and for a brief and slightly absurd interval, he bought some of them back. And then his rival simply raised the figure again, and the staff crossed the street a second time, and the point was made with a clarity that no editorial could improve upon. There was no sum the world could offer that the homestake mine could not exceed. Among the men who went was a cartoonist named Richard Outcall. He had been drawing since 1895, a raucous single-panel strip about the children of a fictional New York slum called Hogan's Alley. Barefoot immigrant urchins with goats and stray dogs, a kind of comic underworld drawn with real affection and real teeth. One character had emerged from the crowd, largely by accident, a jug-eared, bald, gap-toothed small boy in an oversized nightshirt, who did not speak in bubbles but had his remarks scrawled across the shirt itself in the phonetic slang of the tenements. The nightshirt had originally been an indeterminate color. The pressmen of the world had been struggling with a yellow ink that dried too slowly and smeared, and when a faster drying formula was finally mixed, they needed something on the page to test it on. They tested it on the boy's shirt. That is the whole origin, a technical problem in a printing room solved on the garment of a cartoon child. And the child in his new yellow became the most recognizable figure in the city, on buttons, on cigarette packets, on biscuit tins in a stage show. The first mass merchandise comic character in the history of the medium. In the autumn of 1896, he was hired away to the Journal at a salary no cartoonist had ever commanded. And here the older man did something that tells you exactly how far the two of them had already gone. He did not concede the character. He could not, in any case. The copyright had never been properly secured. So he hired another artist, George Looks, and instructed him to go on drawing the yellow child in the world as though nothing had happened. For more than a year, two versions of the same small boy in the same yellow shirt appeared every Sunday in two competing newspapers, produced by two different men, mocking two different sets of enemies. Readers found this hilarious. The rest of the trade found it obscene. And somewhere in the offices of the older, statelier papers of New York, someone reached for a phrase to describe what these two publishers were doing to the profession, and reached for the most visible thing on both their front pages, and called it the yellow press. That is where the term comes from, not from cowardice and not from disease, from a printing ink and a stolen cartoon. What followed was 2 years of escalation without a floor. The Journal took the world's best reporters, and then its best illustrators, and then its business staff. It hired a young editor called Arthur Brisbane, who had come up under Pulitzer and who possessed a talent that would define 20th century tabloid journalism. He could take a story of no importance whatever and, by the sheer size and rhythm of the type in which it was set, make it feel like the fall of a government. Both papers began covering murders as serials. Both sent reporters to solve crimes the police had not solved and to be photographed doing it. Both ran competitions and coupons and free excursions and campaigns to build things and tear things down. Both discovered that a scandal involving a rich woman outsold a scandal involving a poor one by a factor no editor could ignore. And both, crucially, kept cutting margins to hold circulation. The world dropped its price to a penny to match the Journal, and in doing so surrendered the revenue that had made it invulnerable. From that moment forward, every additional reader cost both papers money, and the only way either could survive was to sell more of them tomorrow than they had sold today. Forever. They had built a machine that could not stop. In the autumn of 1896, they were selling, between them, well over 1 million copies a day in a single city. And in that same autumn, 90 miles from the coast of Florida, an island in revolt against a European empire began to look to two men in New York with a machine that could not stop, like the answer to a problem neither of them would have described out loud. It is worth pausing before the last act on what these two objects actually were, because they are difficult to imagine now, and the imagining matters. A copy of either paper in 1897 cost 1 cent, which was less than a loaf of bread and rather less than a glass of beer. It was enormous, a broadsheet that a man on a streetcar had to fold in quarters to read it all, and on Sunday it arrived as a package that could take an hour to get through. It smelled of solvent. It came apart in the hand. It left a gray film on the fingers that every clerk in New York knew and that no soap entirely removed. Inside it was everything. A murder, reported with the enthusiasm of a serial novel and illustrated with a diagram. A society divorce. A boxing result. A column of advice to the lovelorn. A page of women's fashion drawn from Paris. A feature on the canals of Mars written by nobody in particular, presented with complete confidence. A campaign against an ice trust, or a coal trust, or a corrupt commissioner, with his name in the heading and his likeness beneath it. And on Sunday in color the comics, which had existed only for a few years and which were, for hundreds of thousands of children of immigrants, the first English they ever read voluntarily. That last point is not sentimental. It is the commercial fact underneath the entire war. Both men had understood that the largest untapped readership in America was made of people whom the respectable press had written off. Dock workers, seamstresses, domestic servants, boys who sold papers, women who had learned the language from their children. Those readers had never been courted before. They were courted now with an energy that verged on desperation, and they responded by making two newspapers the most powerful private institutions in the country. And they got something real out of it. The Crusades were not fictions. Slum landlords were named. Adulterated milk was tested and reported. Politicians who had never been questioned by anybody were questioned daily and, on occasion, indicted. A reader who bought either paper for the murder diagram received on the same page a running account of exactly how his own city was being robbed. That was the bargain, and it was not a swindle. It was simply inseparable from the other thing, because the other thing was also real. The same appetite that made a corrupt alderman a national villain could make a foreign general a monster on evidence that would not have survived a lawyer's glance. The same editor who could take a slum landlord apart in 3 columns could take a rumor from a dispatch boat and set it in type an inch high, and having said it, could not afford to be wrong in public the following morning. Retractions were small, headlines were not. By 1897, the two of them were spending money at a rate that no newspaper had ever spent it. Dispatch boats, chartered tugs, correspondents in Havana, in Madrid, in Key West, artists, engravers, a telegraph bill that would have supported a small town. All of it had to be recovered from a penny. There is a version of what happened next in which two cynical men manufactured a war for profit. It is a satisfying version, and it is not quite true. What is closer to true is that two men had built, between them, an apparatus of enormous cost and enormous reach, that the apparatus was already pointed at an island 90 miles from the coast of Florida, and that when something happened on that island in February of 1898, neither of them was in any position, financially, professionally, or temperamentally, to say the words we do not yet know. Cuba had been in intermittent revolt against Spain for 30 years. The rising that began in 1895 was the most serious of them, and the Spanish response was the response of an empire that had run out of patience and out of ideas. The rural population was moved off the land and concentrated in guarded towns, so that the insurgents in the hills would have no one to feed them. The towns were not equipped for it. Disease did what disease does in such places. For an American newspaper, this was, in the coldest professional sense, perfect. It was close enough to reach. It was foreign enough that no local advertiser would object. It involved a European monarchy, an oppressed people, and a Spanish general with a name that could be printed in capitals. And it could be covered every single day for as long as it lasted. Both papers went in hard. The Journal went in harder. The Journal did not merely report Cuba, it adopted Cuba. It ran the insurgents' case as though it were the paper's own, printed the atrocities on the front page under headlines an inch high, raised money, and, this was the innovation that most alarmed its rivals, began to intervene directly in events in order to have events to report. In the autumn of 1897, the technique reached its purest expression. There was a young woman in a Havana prison. Her name was Evangelina Cosio y Cisneros. She was 19, the daughter of a man who had taken part in the rebellion, and she had been held for more than a year without trial, accused of involvement in a plot against a senior Spanish officer, an officer who, by her own account, had made advances she had refused. The journal found her and made her the center of an international campaign. Petitions were organized on her behalf across the United States and signed by tens of thousands of American women, among them the mother of the sitting president. The petitions achieved nothing at all, so the paper sent a reporter named Carl Decker to Havana with instructions that had nothing to do with reporting. Decker rented a room in a building adjoining the prison. Over 2 nights, he and a small group of accomplices, a Cuban banker educated in America, and others whose names would remain concealed for a century, climbed to the roof and sawed through the bars of a third-floor cell, having first arranged for the other women in the cell to be given drug pastries so that they would not wake. On the night of the 7th of October, the bars were pulled apart, and the prisoner came out over the roofs. She was hidden for 3 days in the banker's house. Then, dressed as a young man and carrying an unlit cigar to complete the effect, she walked aboard a steamer bound for New York. The journal put her arrival on the front page and called it the greatest journalistic feat of the age. There was a reception at Delmonico's. There was a public appearance in the Madison Square. She was taken to Washington to be presented to the president, escorted by the reporter who had broken her out. Across the street, the world reacted the way a rival reacts when it has been comprehensively beaten. It declared the whole affair a fraud, a stunt, a fiction manufactured for circulation, and hinted that the escape had been bought from Spanish guards rather than achieved. Modern scholarship, working through the papers of the Americans involved, has concluded that the rescue was substantially real, better organized, and with more quiet help from American officials in Havana than the journal ever admitted. It was also, of course, a stunt. Both things were true at once. That is the difficulty with this entire period, and it is the reason it has never stopped being argued about. Which brings us to the sentence that everyone knows. The journal had sent the illustrator Frederick Remington to Cuba, along with the correspondent Richard Harding Davis, to draw the war. Remington, according to the story, found the island quiet, grew bored, and cabled New York to say that there was no trouble, that there would be no war, and that he wished to come home. And the publisher, according to the story, cabled back, "Remain, you furnish the pictures, and I will furnish the war." There is no telegram. There has never been a telegram. Neither cable has ever been found in any archive. The publisher denied for the rest of his life that he had written any such thing, and the illustrator appears never to have mentioned it at all. The entire story rests on a single source, a memoir published in 1901 by a journal correspondent named James Creelman, a man of considerable talent and legendary self-regard, who did not explain where or how he had learned of the exchange, and who was himself in Europe at the time it supposedly took place. Creelman, it is worth noting, told the story as praise. He thought it was magnificent. Whether it happened this way, no document confirms. What can be said is that the anecdote survived because it was useful, first to admirers, then to enemies, and finally to a film made in 1941 that put a version of it on screens across the world and welded it to a name forever. The real question is the larger one underneath it, and it has never been settled. Did the yellow press cause the war? The honest answer is that the yellow press did not, by itself, cause anything. The circulation war was confined to one city. Most Americans did not read the Journal or the World, and never had. There were interests in Washington and in the sugar trade that wanted Spain out of the Caribbean for reasons that had nothing to do with a 19-year-old girl in a Havana cell. What the two papers did was something more specific and arguably more consequential. Over 3 years, they made Cuba a permanent daily presence in the emotional life of the American reader, and they established decisively that a newspaper's proper role was to demand action rather than to describe events. Whether the war would have come without them is unknowable. That it came in the temperature it came in is not seriously disputed. In February of 1898, an American warship lying in Havana Harbor, was destroyed by an explosion, and most of the men aboard her did not survive. The cause was not known then. It has been investigated repeatedly since, and the balance of technical opinion has shifted more than once, and it is not known now. Neither newspaper waited. Within a day, both were treating a Spanish attack as established fact, and within weeks the phrase that would carry the country into a war had been printed so often that its origin had ceased to matter. The war lasted about 10 weeks. The papers covered it with a lavishness that has no precedent. Chartered steamers, dispatch boats, correspondence by the dozen. The journal's proprietor went to Cuba himself and was, by several accounts, in the field with a notebook while the fighting was going on around him. An owner reporting his own war, which is either the purest expression of the profession or its complete collapse, depending on the century you are standing in. And in the middle of it came the small, perfect episode that says everything about what the rivalry had become by then. Both papers were, as everyone in the trade knew, lifting one another's dispatches. The journal's editor, Arthur Brisbane, decided to prove it. He printed a report of the death in action of an Austrian artillery officer of European renown, serving with the Spanish batteries, and gave him a name, Colonel Felipe W. Thenus. The world reprinted it. The journal then explained at length and with enormous pleasure that the name was an anagram, and that what the world had solemnly informed its readers was the phrase, "We pilfer the news." For a month afterwards, the journal ran letters from readers denouncing its rival, proposed a public monument to the fallen colonel, invited designs for it, and offered to fund it with worthless Confederate currency. It was very funny. It was also two of the largest newspapers in the world publicly agreeing, in front of their own readers, that neither of them could be trusted about anything. Both of them had by then passed 1 million copies a day. Both of them were losing money on every copy sold. And both men, in different ways, seemed to have understood at almost the same moment that they had gone too far. There is one more figure who belongs in this account, and he belongs in it precisely because he refused to take part. In August of 1896, while the journal was hiring away the Sunday World, and the two yellow children were beginning to appear side by side across the city, a printer's son from Tennessee borrowed money he did not have and bought a New York newspaper that was, by any commercial standard, finished. It sold perhaps 9,000 copies. It was losing $1,000 a week. A contemporary described it as the most picturesque old ruin among the newspapers of America. Its name was the New York Times. Adolph Oakes was 38. He had been setting type since he was 11, and his judgment of the market he was entering was the exact opposite of everyone else's. He concluded that the noise on Park Row had left an opening, and that the opening was quiet. He put a phrase on the paper in the autumn of 1896, "All the news that's fit to print," and it was, whatever else it became later, a piece of advertising aimed with great precision at two specific buildings. He kept news and opinion apart. He refused advertisements he considered dishonest. He offered, in a city where both of the great papers were paying reporters to break women out of foreign prisons, the radical proposition that a newspaper might simply tell you what had happened. For 2 years, it very nearly killed him. The cost of covering the Spanish War came close to finishing the Times altogether, and his advisors urged him to raise the price, on the reasoning that a higher price would signal to readers that he was not one of the yellows. He did the opposite. In 1898, he cut the price of the Times to a penny, to exactly the price of the Journal and the World. It was the shrewdest decision made by anyone in New York publishing in that decade. It removed the last excuse a serious reader had for buying a sensational paper. And the serious readers came, in numbers that surprised everybody, including him. Circulation trebled within a year. By the early 1900s, it was climbing past 100,000, and by the 1920s into the hundreds of thousands, and it never stopped. The lesson of that, for anyone inclined to treat the 1890s as a morality tale, is inconveniently practical. The yellow press was not defeated by shame, or by editorials in respectable journals, or by the disapproval of the clergy, all of which it received in abundance and enjoyed. It was undercut, commercially, by a man who worked out that a large minority of the reading public would pay the same penny for accuracy, and who was willing to be poor for 2 years while he proved it. For either of them acted on that understanding, the people at the very bottom of the machine acted first. A New York newspaper in 1899 did not deliver itself. It was carried into the streets by children, some of them 14, some of them 10, a few of them 7, who bought their papers outright, at wholesale, and made their living on what they could sell. An unsold copy was not returned. It was simply a loss, paid for out of a child's own pocket, which is why boys were still shouting on corners at 11 o'clock at night. During the war, both papers had raised the price of a bundle of 100 from 50 cents to 60. Circulation had been so vast that no one had complained. When the war ended and the circulation fell back, the price stayed where it was. On the 18th of July in Long Island City, a group of boys caught a delivery man handing over bundles that were short of 100. They tipped his wagon over, chased him up the street, and carried off his papers. And within days, that piece of local vandalism had become something no one had planned. A strike by children against the 2 largest newspapers in the United States. It spread through all 5 boroughs and then out of the city entirely, into New England. The boys organized, elected leaders, held mass meetings, 5,000 of them at one rally, listening to an 18-year-old with one eye known to everybody as Kid Blink, who told them that this was a time that tried the hearts of men and that they had to stick together like glue. They refused to sell the world in the journal, and, where persuasion failed, they made it physically difficult for anyone else to sell them either. The publishers hired men to break up the rallies and to protect the deliveries. It worked. Within 2 weeks, the evening edition of The World had fallen from something like 360,000 copies a day to 125,000. It ended, as these things generally end, in a compromise that looked smaller than it was. On the 1st of August, the 2 papers offered to leave the price alone, but to buy back every unsold copy, and the boys took it, and the union dissolved the following day. Some of them believed to the end of their lives that their leaders had been bought. What they had actually won was the right not to be personally liable for the publisher's overproduction, which, for a child sleeping in a doorway, was not a small thing. 2 men who had spent 3 years explaining to the American public what justice required had been brought to the table by their own newsboys in a fortnight in the middle of summer. The retreat, when it came, was quiet on one side and loud on the other. The older man simply stopped. From about the turn of the century, the world withdrew, by degrees, from the war it had helped to fight. The stunts thinned, the typography calmed. The paper went back to what it had been best at before the journal arrived: investigation, prosecution, the naming of men who had taken money, and it did that work well enough over the following decade that the phrase yellow journalism gradually stopped attaching itself to the world at all, and attached itself instead, permanently, to the man across the street. He never publicly repented. There is no letter in which he confesses. What there is instead is a set of instructions, dictated to secretaries over 20 years, about what a newspaper is for, and a codicil in a will, and a school, and a set of prizes. If that is not repentance, it is at least a very expensive form of second thoughts. The instrument of that change was a Kansan named Frank Cobb, whom he hired as editor of The World in 1904 on a trial basis and then spent 7 years fighting with. Cobb had the one quality the blind man could neither manufacture nor buy. He would not be run from a yacht. He wrote what he thought, he resisted the daily interference dictated from the Mediterranean, and the letters between the 2 of them over those years are a record of an old proprietor slowly, grudgingly discovering that he had found somebody better than himself at the only part of the work he still cared about. In 1907, the proprietor formally resigned, in a statement composed with enormous care and printed in nearly every newspaper in New York, except The World, where Cobb declined to run it. He was, by every account, incandescent. He also kept Cobb, who published the statement 4 years later, on the day the old man died. The substance of what he had wanted said was this: a newspaper should never tolerate injustice or corruption. It should never lack sympathy with the poor. It should remain permanently independent of party, should never be afraid to attack wrongdoing, whether by the rich or by the mob, and should never print anything merely because printing it was profitable. It is a set of instructions that would have made the front pages of 1898 impossible, and the man who dictated it had personally approved those front pages, and he knew it. The other man did not retreat. He expanded. He bought a paper in Chicago. He bought papers in Boston, in Los Angeles, in Atlanta, in San Francisco a second time over. He founded magazines and bought others, and eventually owned Cosmopolitan, Good Housekeeping, and Harper's Bazaar. He founded a news service because the existing wire would not sell to him. He would, within 30 years, control more than 24 daily newspapers with a combined readership in the millions, and the first great newsreel operation, and radio stations, and film studios. No single individual in the history of American media has ever again assembled anything of that scale. And he wanted badly and openly to be president. This is the part of his life that is easiest to underestimate. He was not a dilettante about it. He was elected to Congress from New York in 1902 and again in 1904, and his positions were, for the era, genuinely radical. Public ownership of utilities and railways, the breaking of trusts, an 8-hour day, the direct election of senators. His papers had been attacking the great corporations for a decade, and the working-class readers he had bought with his comic strips turned out, when asked, to be prepared to vote for him. But he could not persuade the men who ran the party. In 1904, he went to the Democratic Convention with real support and was beaten for the nomination. In 1905, he ran for mayor of New York on a ticket of his own creation against the Tammany machine and lost by a margin so narrow, a few thousand votes in more than 600,000, that credible accusations of fraud followed the result for years and were never tested. In 1906, having made peace with the machine he had spent a decade denouncing, he ran for governor of New York and was beaten by Charles Evans Hughes. In 1909, he ran for mayor again and was beaten badly. And working against him through all of it, quietly and with great effect, was something his own newspapers had printed. In February of 1900, Ambrose Bierce, the satirist he had hired in San Francisco and given his head, had written a short verse about the killing of a governor in Kentucky, which speculated, in the tone of a man being clever, about where the next bullet in American politics might land. It named the president. It was published, and it was forgotten, and nobody at the time thought very much about it at all. On the 6th of September, 1901, President William McKinley was attacked by an anarchist in Buffalo. He died of his injuries 8 days later. The Hearst papers had been assailing McKinley without mercy for 5 years. Within hours, rival newspapers had gone back through the files, found the verse, reprinted it, and set about establishing in the public mind a straight line from a columnist's cleverness to a dead president. It was, on the evidence, a false line. The man responsible could not read English and cited an entirely different influence. It did not matter. Effigies were burned, the papers were boycotted in some cities and thrown out of some clubs. The proprietor, for the first time in his life, was on the defensive. He renamed the morning paper, and he did not sack Bierce, and he never fully escaped it. When he ran for governor 5 years later, an emissary of the president was sent to Syracuse to remind the voters of New York of exactly that verse and exactly who had paid for it. Politics, in the end, gave him nothing. The machine he had built to make himself heard by 50 million people turned out to be the thing that made him impossible to elect. The older man, meanwhile, had one last fight in him, and it was the one that mattered. In the autumn of 1908, in the closing weeks of a presidential election, the world revived a set of old rumors about the purchase of the Panama Canal, specifically about where the $40 million paid by the United States government for the French company's holdings had actually gone, and whose relatives had been standing nearby when it went. The paper had no proof. It said so. What it said, in effect, was that the sums did not reconcile and that the public was entitled to an accounting. Theodore Roosevelt, in the last months of his presidency, was not in a mood to be asked. He sent a special message to Congress denouncing the accusations as a libel against the United States itself and describing the publisher of the World as a man whom it was a high national duty to bring to justice. And then he did something no American president had done before and none has done since. He had the federal government indict a newspaper for criminal libel. There was, awkwardly, no federal law of criminal libel. The prosecutors got around this by an argument of genuine ingenuity. The world had been circulated at West Point and in a federal post office in New York, both of them federal enclaves. And on federal ground, the law of the state could be borrowed and applied by the national government. Indictments were handed down in Washington and in New York in the spring of 1909, half an hour after Roosevelt had ceased to be president. The blind man on the yacht fought it for 2 years. He was 62. He could not read a page of the case. He had it read to him. On the 3rd of January 1911, the Supreme Court of the United States decided unanimously that the federal government could not maintain the prosecution, that if an offense had been committed at all, it had been committed within the jurisdiction of the state of New York, and that the government of the United States had no business prosecuting a newspaper in a federal court for what it had printed. It has been called the last gasp of seditious libel in America. A legal journal of the day called it one of the substantial guarantees of the continued freedom of the press. He had 10 months to live. He spent the last summer of his life, where he had spent most of the previous 20, moving between the Tower in Maine and the yacht. Something should be said here about what those years had cost the people around him. He had married a beautiful woman and then made her the manager of a household organized entirely around a sick man's nerves. Kate Davis Pulitzer spent decades arranging silence. Staff dismissed for creaking, meals timed, guests instructed, rooms padded, and long stretches of the year in which her husband was somewhere in the Mediterranean, and she was not. There were 7 children, and he was, by the recollection of more than one of them, an exacting and largely absent presence, testing them in conversation the way he tested his secretaries and quick to find them wanting. 2 of the 7 did not grow up. A daughter, Catherine Ethel, died of pneumonia at 2 in the spring of 1884, in the same year that her father's newspaper became the most read in America. And on the last day of 1897, in the Tower at Bar Harbor, after an illness of some 4 months, the eldest daughter, Lucille, died of typhoid fever at 17. She had made her first appearance in society that summer. She was said to be the child her father loved best, and there is a scholarship at Barnard College in her name. And when the School of Journalism was finally built, it was dedicated to her memory. The house in New York burned too, the earlier one on East 55th Street, in January of 1900 in the night. The family got out. 2 of the servants did not. One of them, according to the account preserved at Columbia, went back into the building to save the Christmas presents. In October of 1911, the yacht Liberty was making south toward the winter house on Jekyll Island, off the coast of Georgia, and put into Charleston Harbor. He was taken ill there, and the family was sent for from New York, and they arrived in time. On the 29th of October, a secretary sat beside him and read aloud, in German, a history of Louis XI of France. He was 64. He had been blind for more than 20 years, and for all of those years the world had reached him as a voice in a darkened room. As the reading neared its end, he said, in the language of his childhood, softly, quite softly. Then he stopped speaking and did not begin again. He left an estate of some $30 million and 2 instructions. The first was that $2 million of it should go to Columbia University to found a school of journalism, an idea he had first offered in 1892 when the university had politely declined it, because in 1892 the notion that reporting was a profession requiring education struck serious people as faintly comic. The school opened in 1912, the year after he died. The prizes attached to the endowment were first awarded in 1917, and the name that had been a byword for sensationalism for 20 years began, slowly, over the following decades, to mean the opposite of what it had meant in 1898. The second instruction was that the world must never be sold. It was sold in 1931. The paper had drifted after his death. His eldest son, Ralph, ran it. The third son, Joseph II, took the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and ran it superbly for decades. The family found, as families do, that the will of a dead man is a difficult thing to operate. Circulation slid. A price rise went wrong. Then the Depression took the advertising, and the trust that held the estate could not raise capital against a paper it was forbidden to sell. On the 27th of February 1931, Three brothers obtained a judge's consent to break their father's instruction and sold The World and the Evening World to the Scripps Howard chain for about $5 million. The staff had tried to buy it themselves and had been refused. More than 2,000 people lost their work in the third winter of the Depression. The buyer folded the name into an existing evening paper, and the New York World Telegram appeared the next morning, carrying nothing of the world but the word. The dome on Park Row outlived the paper by 24 years. It was pulled down in the 1950s to widen the approach to a bridge. The other man lived another 20 years, and his ending was slower and more public. He had married in 1903, Millicent Wilson, a chorus girl half his age, with whom he had 5 sons. The marriage lasted in the formal sense for the rest of his life. From 1917 onward, he lived openly with the actress Marion Davies, whose career he promoted with a persistence that did her reputation more harm than good. She was a genuinely gifted comedian, and he insisted on putting her in costume dramas. Millicent would not divorce him. He did not press it. The arrangement held for 34 years, with a wife in New York and a companion in California, and society dealt with it by excluding the woman and continuing to accept the man, which is how society usually deals with such things. And on a hill above the Pacific at San Simeon, on land his father had bought as a ranch, he began in 1919 to build the thing he had been thinking about since he was 10 years old in a European cathedral. He worked at it with the architect Julia Morgan for nearly 30 years and never finished it. Whole ceilings were bought out of Spanish monasteries and shipped across the Atlantic. There were Roman sarcophagi, medieval tapestries, an indoor pool of marble and gold leaf, and for a time the largest private zoo in the world, with zebras grazing along the drive. He was buying at his peak on a scale that made him a significant force in the international art market, and he was paying for it out of income, and the income depended on the newspapers, and the newspapers depended on advertising. In 1929, the advertising began to go. By the middle of the 1930s, the debt of his companies ran to well over $100 million. Papers were closed and merged. The magazines were mortgaged. The art was sold, not quietly, but in public auction and in the basement of a New York department store, which was worse. The animals were sold to a zoo in Los Angeles. Construction at San Simeon stopped, and the house itself was mortgaged for $600,000. In 1937, the empire was placed under a court-supervised reorganization, and control of it passed to a trustee, Clarence Shern, a lawyer who had once been the publisher's own attorney and had run for office with his backing. The man who had bought an entire newspaper staff in an afternoon now drew a salary at the pleasure of a committee as editorial director of the papers he had created. His salary was cut, his dividend was stopped, and in the middle of that collapse, Marion Davies sold property and jewelry and put $1 million of her own money into his hands at a moment when no bank in America would have lent him a cent. She was, at that point, retiring from film at 40. The figure is given as $1 million in the contemporary accounts and as a larger sum in some later ones. The essential fact is not in dispute. He survived it. The war economy restored the advertising, the debt was worked down, and by the middle of the 1940s, he was, on paper, solvent again and still in possession of the largest media organization in the country. But he never again controlled it in the way he had, and he knew it. Then, in 1941, a 25-year-old made a film. Citizen Kane was not a documentary, and its central figure is not, in any exact sense, a portrait. The character borrows from several men, and the most wounding element in it, the treatment of the second wife, corresponded to nothing in Marion Davies's real gifts. It did not matter. He recognized enough of himself to be enraged, and he moved against it with everything he had left. His newspapers refused advertising for the film. His columnists went after the studio, the theater chains were pressured, and the picture opened narrowly. Lost money, and was booed at the Academy Awards before being quietly shelved. He won that fight in the short term completely. It is the single most comprehensively self-defeating victory in the history of American publishing. Within 20 years, the film had been rediscovered and was being described as the greatest ever made in the country, and it has been taught, revived, and re-released ever since. The consequence is that 100 million people who could not tell you what the San Francisco Examiner was, or who Morrill Goddard was, or what happened in Havana in 1897, nonetheless carry in their heads an image of a newspaper baron dying alone in a half-built palace full of crates. He had spent 60 years deciding what the American public would think about other people. The last thing the American public was told about him was written by somebody else. He left San Simeon in 1947 when his heart began to fail and moved to a house in Beverly Hills to be near his doctors. Marion Davies stayed with him. He died there on the 14th of August, 1951, at 88, and was buried in the family mausoleum outside San Francisco, and she was not at the funeral. What is left of them now is not symmetrical, and the asymmetry is the most interesting thing about the whole affair. The Hungarian's newspaper is gone. The building it was written in is gone. The evening edition, the Gold Dome, the private code, the tower on the Maine coast. That tower came down in the 1930s. The yacht, the whole apparatus of a life spent buying silence. All of it dispersed. What survives is a school and a set of prizes announced every spring, and the fact that in the ordinary speech of the 21st century, his surname is a synonym for excellence in exactly the profession he did most to debase. The Californian's newspapers, by contrast, are still here. The corporation he founded survived him and grew, and its holdings today would be unrecognizable to him and entirely comprehensible. Magazines, television, information services, an empire of a kind he would have understood immediately. The house on the hill is still there too, finished enough to be visited, with its Roman sarcophagi and its Spanish ceilings and its marble pool, open to anyone with the price of a ticket. And what survives of him personally, in the mind of the general public, is a fictional character in somebody else's film and a sentence about photographs in a war that he almost certainly never said. One of them lost the business and kept the name. The other kept the business and lost the name. Neither outcome was designed. That is worth saying plainly, because the temptation with a story like this is to arrange it into a moral, and the men themselves would have found the moral unpersuasive. They were not villains, either of them, and they were not simply cynics. The Hungarian genuinely believed that a newspaper existed to make powerful men afraid, and he acted on that belief for 40 years at considerable personal cost. And the record of what he exposed is real. The Californian genuinely believed that the working people of American cities were being robbed by trusts and machines, and he printed that belief for half a century, and it cost him the presidency he wanted. What they discovered, and what nobody had discovered before them, because nobody before them had the presses to discover it with, was that the same instrument that makes a wrong visible to a million people is the instrument that makes a lie visible to a million people, and that the instrument does not know the difference, and that the man operating it at speed at 2 in the morning, with a rival across the street and a deadline in 40 minutes, will not always know the difference either. Everything that has been said about the media in the century since was said about the two of them first. Late in the 1890s, at the height of it, either man could have stopped. Neither did, because each of them was certain that the other would not. That is the whole mechanism of a feud, and it is why feuds outlast the people conducting them. The World and the Journal were not really fighting each other by the end. They were both fighting a machine that required, every single morning, something louder than yesterday. The presses on Park Row have been silent for a long time. The street is a short walk of office buildings now, and the traffic that runs down it toward the bridge does not shake in the way the pavement once shook at 2 in the morning. Somewhere under that noise, a 19-year-old woman is being carried across a rooftop in Havana. A cartoon child in a yellow nightshirt is being drawn, twice, in 2 different rooms, by 2 men who no longer speak. A blind publisher in a padded cabin off the coast of Carolina is listening to a story about a French king and asking, very politely, for the reader to lower her voice. Some feuds, in the end, outlive both the men who started them, and everything those men believed they were fighting for.